This is Cambodia, a country roughly the size of the state of Oklahoma, nestled between Vietnam, Laos and Thailand in Southeast Asia. In the late 1960s, it was home to approximately 7 million people, the vast majority of whom were rice farmers, living in small villages scattered across lush, flat countryside and dense jungle. Cambodia was a neutral nation, led by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who had spent years walking an impossibly fine diplomatic line to keep his country out of the war that was tearing its neighbors apart. Between March of 1969 and May of 1970, the United States dropped over 110,000 tons of bombs on this neutral country. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 6 times the explosive tonnage dropped on Hiroshima. And incredibly, almost none of it was reported to Congress or to the American public. Tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians would be killed or displaced. Entire villages would be erased from the map, and the destabilization caused by the bombing would help give rise to one of the most horrifying regimes in modern history, the Khmer Rouge. This is their story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. To understand why the United States secretly bombed Cambodia, we first need to understand the situation in Vietnam by early 1969. The Vietnam War had been escalating for years. By the time Richard Nixon took office on January 20, 1969, over 31,000 American soldiers had already been killed. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, a massive coordinated series of surprise attacks by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, had shattered public confidence that the war was being won. Protests were erupting across the United States. Nixon had campaigned on a promise to end the war, and yet, behind closed doors, he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were pursuing a very different strategy. The central military problem, as Nixon and Kissinger saw it, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of supply routes running from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia that allowed the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong to funnel troops, weapons, ammunition, and supplies into South Vietnam. This logistical network was, in military terms, the workhorse of the North Vietnamese war effort. It was advanced beyond what American strategists had initially anticipated, incorporating everything from simple jungle footpaths to paved roads capable of handling truck convoys, all hidden beneath dense triple canopy jungle. Of particular concern was an area of eastern Cambodia that American military intelligence designated the Central Office for South Vietnam, or COSVN. This was believed to be a kind of mobile headquarters, a nerve center from which the North Vietnamese directed operations in the south. American military planners described it as a sprawling complex of bunkers, communications hubs, and supply depots, all tucked just across the Cambodian border, sometimes no more than 5 or 10 miles inside neutral territory. The rule that governed international engagement with Cambodia was straightforward. Cambodia was neutral. Prince Sihanouk had not authorized any foreign military operations on his soil. The Geneva Accords of 1954 had recognized Cambodia's sovereignty and neutrality. Under international law, and under the United States Constitution, bombing a country with which you are not at war requires, at minimum, congressional authorization. It was a line that, publicly at least, the Johnson administration had been unwilling to cross. But Nixon was not Johnson. And Kissinger, a strict no-nonsense strategist who viewed the war through the cold lens of geopolitical leverage, believed that destroying the Cambodian sanctuaries was essential to any successful outcome in Vietnam. Together, they would authorize a bombing campaign of unprecedented secrecy, one that would eventually be codenamed Operation Menu. The planning for what would become Operation Menu began almost immediately after Nixon took office. On February 9, 1969, General Creighton Abrams, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, sent a cable to Washington requesting authorization to bomb a specific target inside Cambodia, a suspected North Vietnamese base camp designated Base Area 353. Abrams argued that the base was being used as a staging ground for attacks against American forces and that destroying it would save American lives. Nixon and Kissinger were receptive. However, the political reality was this. The American public was already deeply divided over Vietnam. News that the president was expanding the war into a neutral country, especially while publicly promising to wind the war down, would be, in Kissinger's own assessment, politically catastrophic. Congress had not been consulted. The American people had not been told. And so from the very beginning, the operation was designed to be invisible. The system they devised to achieve this was, in a disturbing way, ingenious. Here's how it worked. AB-52 Stratofortress, the workhorse of America's strategic bombing fleet. A massive 8-engine aircraft capable of carrying up to 60,000 pounds of conventional ordnance would take off from Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam, or from Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield in Thailand. The crew would be briefed on a target inside South Vietnam. This was the official mission, and it was logged through normal channels in the standard military reporting system. But once the aircraft was airborne, a ground radar site in South Vietnam, operated under the control of a special, highly compartmentalized unit, would redirect the bomber to its actual target inside Cambodia. The crew would receive new coordinates. The bombs would fall on Cambodian soil. And when the mission reports were filed, a dual reporting system ensured that the official records showed only the original fictitious target in South Vietnam. The real coordinates, the real target, the real tonnage dropped on Cambodia, all of it was recorded on a separate, classified set of documents that were kept under lock and key and shared with only a handful of people. The first strike, codenamed Breakfast, took place on March 18, 1969. 60 B-52s dropped their payloads on Base Area 353, located in the Fishhook region of Svay Rieng Province, Cambodia. The explosions reportedly destroyed bunkers. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition stores had been hit, and military planners declared the mission a success. Within the Pentagon, only a small circle of officers knew the bombs had fallen inside Cambodia. The flight crews themselves were often unaware that they had crossed the border. Everything seemed, from the outside, routine. And it was precisely this appearance of routine that made the deception so effective, because after breakfast came lunch, after lunch came snack, then dinner, then supper, then dessert. Each code name designated a different Cambodian base area. Each mission followed the same dual reporting protocol, and with each successive strike, the campaign expanded deeper into Cambodia, hitting targets that were further and further from the Vietnamese border. On the ground in Cambodia, the reality of Operation Menu was anything but a sterile military exercise with code names borrowed from a dining table. The B-52 Stratofortress was designed for a very specific purpose: saturation bombing. When a formation of B-52s, typically flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, invisible and inaudible from the ground, released their payloads, the result was what the military called a box pattern of destruction. A single B-52 carried 108 500-pound bombs, or a mix of 500 and 750-pound ordnance. When 3 aircraft bombed in formation, the result was the obliteration of an area roughly 1 mile long and half a mile wide. Every living thing within that box, every tree, every structure, every person, was subject to blast overpressure, shrapnel and concussive force that could rupture internal organs even without direct impact. For the Cambodian villagers living in or near the targeted areas, there was no warning. There was no air raid siren, no leaflet drop, no announcement. The bombs simply arrived. A faint rumble from above, and then the world became fire and noise and dirt. Survivors described the experience as the ground itself rising beneath them. Houses made of wood and thatch were vaporized. Rice paddies were cratered beyond recognition. Water buffalo and livestock were torn apart. And the people farmers, families, children, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment, were killed instantly or left with horrifying injuries, shattered limbs, burst eardrums, flash burns, and the slow suffocation of collapsed lungs. And here is the part that makes this so deeply disturbing. Because Cambodia was neutral, there were no military hospitals, no field medics, no evacuation routes for civilians. The villages that were hit existed in many cases beyond the reach of any medical infrastructure. The wounded were carried by their families through jungle trails to distant provincial towns, where the nearest doctor might be a single overwhelmed practitioner with no surgical equipment. Many of the injured simply died where they fell, or in the hours and days that followed, from infections, internal bleeding, or shock. Meanwhile, in Washington, the secret held. Nixon and Kissinger monitored the results through classified channels. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird was aware of the campaign, as was Secretary of State William Rogers, though Rogers reportedly expressed private reservations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were informed, but Congress was kept entirely in the dark. When Senator J. William Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, asked pointed questions about possible military operations in Cambodia during hearings in 1969 and 1970, he was given misleading or flatly false answers by Pentagon officials. The falsification of records was systematic. Air Force Major Hal Knight, who served as a ground radar operator directing the B-52s to their Cambodian targets, later testified that he had been explicitly ordered to burn the records of each mission's true coordinates after the strikes were complete. A separate set of sanitized reports, showing targets inside South Vietnam, was fed into the official record. The scale of the deception was, even by the standards of wartime secrecy, unprecedented. This was not a single classified operation. It was the systematic falsification of military records over a 14-month period, involving hundreds of bombing sorties and thousands of service members, all to conceal from the American people and their elected representatives that their government was waging a secret war against a country it was not officially at war with. As Operation Menu continued month after month, its effects rippled outward in ways that the planners in Washington had either failed to anticipate or simply chose to ignore. The bombing did not destroy COSVN. This was, in retrospect, because COSVN was never the fixed, sprawling headquarters complex that American intelligence had imagined. It was a mobile command structure, a collection of staff officers who moved constantly through the jungle, carrying their communications equipment with them. Bombing their suspected location was, as one military historian later described it, like trying to kill a swarm of bees by dropping a boulder on the spot where you last saw them. What the bombing did accomplish was the devastation of the Cambodian countryside. Villages were destroyed, agricultural land was cratered, tens of thousands of civilians were displaced, streaming toward Phnom Penh and provincial capitals in search of safety. The refugee population swelled, straining Cambodia's limited infrastructure. And perhaps most significantly, the bombing drove the North Vietnamese forces deeper into Cambodia, not out of it. Instead of retreating back across the border into Vietnam, the North Vietnamese pushed westward, further into Cambodian territory, disrupting the fragile balance that Prince Sihanouk had maintained for years. Sihanouk's position became increasingly untenable. He had privately tolerated a limited North Vietnamese presence along his eastern border as the cost of keeping Cambodia out of the wider war. But as the bombing intensified and the North Vietnamese moved further into his country, his neutrality became a fiction. On March 18, 1970, exactly 1 year after the first breakfast strike, Sihanouk was overthrown in a coup led by his own Prime Minister, General Lon Nol, while Sihanouk was traveling abroad. The new government was pro-American and immediately aligned itself with the United States against North Vietnam. The overthrow of Sihanouk did not stabilize Cambodia. It did the opposite. The country was plunged into civil war. And into this chaos stepped the Khmer Rouge, a small, radical communist movement that had been largely marginal under Sihanouk's rule. The bombing, the displacement, the destruction of rural Cambodian society, all of it became a recruitment tool for the Khmer Rouge. Peasant farmers who had lost their homes, their families, their rice paddies to American bombs were told that the United States and its puppet government in Phnom Penh were their enemy. The Khmer Rouge's ranks swelled from an estimated 4,000 fighters in 1972, over 70,000 by 1975. And this is where the full weight of the tragedy comes into focus. Because the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, would go on to seize Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975, and impose one of the most brutal regimes in human history. In the 4 years that followed, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, roughly a quarter of the entire population, would die from execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease in what became known as the Cambodian genocide. The killing fields, the emptying of cities, the systematic murder of anyone perceived as educated or connected to the old regime, all of it grew from the soil that the secret bombing had poisoned. Now, to be clear, it would be a vast oversimplification to say that the American bombing caused the Cambodian genocide. The Khmer Rouge's ideology, Pol Pot's fanaticism, the geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, all of these factors played critical roles. But virtually every serious historical analysis of the period acknowledges that the secret bombing of Cambodia was a significant contributing factor in destabilizing the country and creating the conditions in which the Khmer Rouge could seize power. The secret did not hold forever. On May 9, 1969, William Beecher, a reporter for the New York Times, published an article with the headline, "Raids in Cambodia by US Unprotested." The article described American B-52 strikes inside Cambodia. Incredibly, the story generated almost no public reaction. It was a single article in a sea of Vietnam War coverage, and it lacked the kind of official confirmation or leaked documentation that might have turned it into a scandal. Nixon and Kissinger were furious nonetheless, and in response they authorized the wiretapping of several government officials and journalists in an attempt to identify the source of the leak. These wiretaps would later become part of the broader pattern of illegal surveillance that culminated in the Watergate scandal. The full scope of Operation Menu did not become public until 1973, when Major Hal Knight, the radar operator who had been ordered to destroy mission records, came forward and testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. His testimony, combined with investigative journalism and the release of classified documents, revealed the systematic falsification of military records that had concealed the bombing for years. The revelation was devastating. Congress, already reeling from the broader revelations about Watergate, moved to reassert its authority over the war-making power. In November 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution over Nixon's veto, requiring the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action and limiting the duration of such deployments without congressional authorization. It was a direct response to the kind of unilateral, secret military action that Operation Menu represented. The House Judiciary Committee considered the secret bombing of Cambodia as one of the proposed articles of impeachment against Nixon in 1974. Ultimately, the committee voted against including it, focusing instead on the obstruction of justice related to Watergate. But the fact that it was discussed at all, that the secret bombing of a neutral nation was weighed as a potential high crime and misdemeanor, speaks to the gravity of what had been done. Henry Kissinger, for his part, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for negotiating the Paris Peace Accords that ended direct American involvement in Vietnam. The award was, and remains, one of the most controversial in the history of the Nobel Prize. 2 members of the Norwegian Nobel Committee resigned in protest. Kissinger's co-laureate, North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho, declined the prize, stating that peace had not actually been achieved in Vietnam. And for the people of Cambodia, who had endured over 110,000 tons of American bombs dropped in secret on their neutral country, a campaign authorized in significant part by the man now receiving the world's most prestigious Peace Prize, the award felt like what many have called an indescribable injustice. To this day, Cambodia bears the scars of the bombing. Unexploded ordnance, bombs that were dropped but did not detonate, still litters the Cambodian countryside. The Cambodian Mine Action Center estimates that since 1979, more than 64,000 Cambodians have been killed or injured by unexploded bombs, mines and other remnants of war. Farmers plowing their fields still uncover 500-pound bombs buried in the soil. Children playing in the jungle still find cluster munitions half hidden in the undergrowth. Each year, despite decades of clearance efforts, people continue to die from ordnance that was dropped over 50 years ago. Bomb craters dot the landscape of eastern Cambodia like the surface of the moon. In some areas, satellite imagery reveals the Earth still pockmarked so densely that the craters overlap, creating a surreal, almost alien terrain. These craters fill with rainwater during the monsoon season, and Cambodian farmers have adapted by using them as fish ponds. A quiet, practical response to a landscape that was reshaped by violence. The Yale University Cambodian Genocide Program has mapped the bombing in extraordinary detail, using declassified military data to plot the location and tonnage of every recorded strike. Their research revealed that the total tonnage of American bombs dropped on Cambodia, including both the secret Operation Menu campaign and the subsequent openly acknowledged Operation Freedom Deal that continued from 1970 to 1973, exceeded 2.7 million tons. That is more tonnage than the Allies dropped on all of Europe and the Pacific during the entirety of World War II, on a country the size of Oklahoma. On a country that was not at war with the United States. The number of Cambodian civilians killed by the bombing remains difficult to determine with precision. Estimates range from 50,000 to over 150,000. The true number may never be known, because the villages that were destroyed were often remote, their populations unregistered, their deaths unrecorded. In many cases, entire communities simply ceased to exist, and no one was left to report what had happened. Their names were never written down. Their stories were never told. History, in a very real sense, lost track of them. And that was sort of the end of their story. No American official was ever criminally charged for the secret bombing of Cambodia. No reparations were paid to the Cambodian people. Nixon resigned from the presidency in August 1974 over Watergate, not Cambodia. Kissinger continued to serve as Secretary of State under President Gerald Ford and remained one of the most influential foreign policy voices in America for decades, passing away in November 2023 at the age of 100. Calls by human rights organizations and legal scholars to hold him accountable for the bombing and for his role in other controversial Cold War operations went unanswered throughout his lifetime. In Cambodia itself, the memory of the bombing is woven into the national consciousness alongside the memory of the Khmer Rouge and the genocide that followed. The Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh and the Chuang Et Killing Fields Memorial stand as reminders of what happened after the bombs stopped falling. But for many Cambodians, the story begins not with the Khmer Rouge's seizure of power in 1975, but with the first explosion that shook their village on a morning in 1969 when they had no idea why the sky was falling. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching.